In many sports, the amount of ways that a coach can influence what's happening on the court is very limited. Sure, he or she can shout some instructions from the sideline in the hopes that the athletes are able to use them and increase their performance. But the effectiveness of this sideline coaching can be very limited. Athletes might not even be able to hear what a coach is saying because they are too far away or there's too much noise. And sometimes athletes don't have enough time to process and implement what a coach is saying. Some sports provide the coach with a unique tool that allows them to talk to their athletes and try and change some of the things they see on the court. I'm of course talking about the timeout. The amount of timeouts and the length of timeout really depends per sport. For instance, in handball, a coach gets one 1-minute timeout per half, while in volleyball, a coach gets two 30-second timeouts per set. And that's on top of the two 1-minute mandatory technical timeouts. These moments provide a unique opportunity for a coach to talk about technical aspects, tactical aspects, and even psychological aspects. So in this video, I want to look at a few things. First, what makes a coach call a timeout? And then second, what is a coach trying to achieve with a timeout? And lastly, does a timeout really have an effect on the performance of the team and their opponents? First, let's look at when coaches decide to call a timeout. It seems that coaches look at 3 different factors when deciding to call a timeout. First, the current score in the game. And that's mostly taking into account how far behind their team is. Second is the time of game, or at what stage of the game they are. For instance, whether it's the beginning or the end of the half. And lastly, the short-term performance of their team. However, the decision to take a timeout is not based on any single one of these factors. Rather, coaches look at the weight of each individual factor, and the combined weight of these determine whether they call a timeout or not. To illustrate how this works, imagine each factor as a block. The size of the block is determined by how important each factor is in that particular moment. So for instance, if a team is very far behind on the scoreboard, the block for the current score becomes a lot bigger. Now, we will call the moment in which a coach decides to call a timeout the timeout threshold, which you can see on the right of your screen. Now let's say a handball team just conceded 2 goals, is 3 goals behind, but it's early in the first half. As you can see, the factors together do not reach the threshold, and therefore the coach is not likely to call a timeout. But if this same situation happens later in the match, the factor of time of game is a lot bigger. And now the threshold is reached and the coach will most likely call a timeout. But some scenarios don't require all 3 factors to reach the threshold. Let's take an example of a volleyball team that is in the lead by a score of 24-22 in the final set of a match. This is the most crucial point in the game, and therefore the time factor is almost enough to reach the threshold on its own. Despite the fact that this team just scored the last 4 points in a row and only need 1 more point to win the set, the coach is likely to call a timeout if the opponent scores the next point. Knowing what are the factors that make coaches decide to take a timeout or not, the next step is to look at what coaches are trying to achieve by calling a timeout. The most important one was to break the opponent's momentum. Other reasons were to give athletes a physical and psychological break, to change or emphasize tactical aspects, and to create higher motivation in their athletes. Looking at what coaches say during a timeout reflect these objectives. Coaches seem to include roughly 2 to 3 points in each timeout and mainly focus on tactics and psychological factors such as breaking the flow. Interestingly, the content of the timeout is not related to the score and the time of game. But most importantly, coaches believe that calling a timeout will influence their team's performance on the court in a positive way. They believe that they can alter the final outcome of a game by using their timeouts strategically. In the end, I think this is the goal of every coach that is allowed to use timeouts. And that raises a very interesting question. Do timeouts actually influence performance? Now, numerous studies have looked into the effects of timeouts on teams' own and opponents' performance. Personally, I found it very surprising to find that the conclusive answer seems to be yes. A timeout influences a team's performance positively, while it influences the other team's performance negatively. This means that calling a timeout is an effective tool a coach has to influence the outcome of a match. For instance, a study looking at post-timeout performance in handball concluded that within the first, third, and fifth possession after a timeout, the team scored 0.59, 1.4, and 1.85 more goals than before the timeout. On the other hand, the opponent scored 0.59, 1.4, and 2.04 less goals after the timeout. Similar results have been found in basketball when looking at the third and fifth possession after a timeout. The team calling the timeout scored 1.59 and 2.10 points more than before the timeout, while the opponent scored 1.59 and 1.77 points less. Now, these results seem very convincing, and it almost seems like timeouts have an enormous impact on game scoring. However, take into account that weak short-term performance is an important factor that leads to timeouts. So there's a good chance that the team that called the timeout was scoring very poorly before, while their opponents were scoring very strongly. So in real life, their scoring abilities are probably closer together than these results make it seem. Overall, I think there's a lot of interesting science behind the timeout. And for coaches, it is important to understand what factors lead to an effective use of this tool. Before I started making this video, I had no idea that the timeout was such an effective tool of influencing the outcome of a game. Let me know how you use your timeouts and what you think about using timeouts. If you enjoyed the video, please make sure to like and subscribe to my channel.